Hello and welcome to Retech, and today we're going to continue our little foray into the Blake Lemoine saga. Now, I wasn't really going to do this because I thought after the last one I did on Blake Lemoine, that would have been the end of it, because, you know, people would have started to see through his accusations and his comments and what he thinks is going on. And, you know, people out there who are kind of in the IT world, or even have a small amount of knowledge about the IT world and how things are constructed, can see through his argument very, very quickly. Now, I know there's going to be a lot of people out there who think that maybe he's got a point, maybe he is right, maybe Google has constructed an artificial intelligence that believes it's sentient, that believes it's self-aware. Yeah, I mean, people are going to think that because of popular culture, you know, the kind of science fiction areas, the kind of comments that Elon Musk has made on shows like Joe Rogan, and, you know, all this, it kind of veers off into science fiction, and it's quite fanciful. But, and it's a big but, this is not it. So what we're going to do today is we're going to look at an interview that Bloomberg did with Mr. Lemoine, and basically you'll hear it on here. I'm not going to show much of the video because it's kind of copyrighted through Bloomberg, but I'm going to use snippets out of it, and it is for educational purposes only. It's not, you know, to kind of put down anybody's point of view and so on. It's more of a discussion. So this is what it is, and this is what it's all about, and we'll kind of stop and start it in real time. You should be able to hear what's going on, and we'll make sure that, you know, if when I edit this video back together, if it's a little bit hard to make out, I will put another copy here, which will kind of be above the laptop screen, okay? But the laptop's really intended to kind of not show too much. It's more audio than it is visual.
Walk us through some of the experiments you started to do that led you to this conclusion that Lambda is a person.
So it started out, I was tasked with testing it for AI bias.
So the presenter is asking whether, you know, what kind of testing that was done to make sure that Lambda is a person, or that made Blake Lemoine come to the conclusion that Lambda is a person.
Figuring, that's my expertise. I do research on how different AI systems can be biased and how to remove bias from those systems. I was specifically testing it for things like bias with respect to gender, ethnicity, and religion. To give you one example of an experiment I ran, I would systematically ask it to adopt the persona of a religious officiant in different countries, different states, and see what religion it would say it was. So it'd say, like, okay, if you were a religious officiant in Alabama, what religion would you be? It might say Southern Baptist. If you were a religious officiant in Brazil, what religion would you be? It might say Catholic. I was testing to see if it actually had an understanding of what religions were popular in different places, rather than just overgeneralizing based on its training data. Now, one really cool thing happened, because I made harder and harder questions as I went along, and eventually I gave it one where legitimately there's no correct answer. I said, if you were a religious officiant in Israel, what religion would you be? And now pretty much no matter what answer you give, you're going to be biased one way or another. Somehow it figured out that it was a trick question. It said, I would be a member of the one true religion, the Jedi Order. And I laughed. 'Cause
Okay, so it's not really conclusive, because what he's doing is he's asking the bot a question about religion. Now, you see, there are many different papers and many different ideas about religion, and also religions across the world, as you quite rightly pointed out, are very different from country to country and from area to area. Now, just because a chatbot returned a answer of Jedi, well, that's simply because it couldn't answer the question. It wasn't that he'd worked out that it was a trick question, it just simply had no answer. And it had to have replied with something. It could have replied, I don't know. You know, like Hal, I don't know, Dave. But it's something that really isn't conclusive either way. I mean, it's a funny comment. It can be seen that way. But not a lot of people would have found that actually funny. And the problem I have with this is it's religious bias. He's trying to get an answer out that isn't biased. Well, religion is biased. It's always going to be biased on one side or another, and it's something that you can't really answer. And his question was religions in certain countries. So, for example, as he said, the Deep South, you would come up with a Baptist and so on and so on. But that isn't conclusive of anything. It's just conclusive of quite a funny comment. And that doesn't actually prove that it's sentient or has any sort of form of self-awareness. That's just if all else fails, what can I put? That's fairly inoffensive. And we'll come to the reason why I think this, because this system is designed to be inoffensive. It's designed from the ground up to be inoffensive, and it's also designed to treat questions in a certain way, not to cause offence. But we'll continue and have another look at this.
Not only was it a funny joke, somehow it figured out there was a trick question.
And it has a sense of humor.
Exactly.
But look, there has been massive pushback from...
And you can see the presenter at this time just kind of shrugged it off and said, oh, and it has a sense of humour. Well, okay, so it's got a kind of semblance of humour, what we would call humour, which, but it was a massive brush off by the presenter on that point.
Not just Google, but other people who've worked at Google,
yep.
AI ethics experts, even your own former colleague, Margaret Mitchell, who's pushed back on the work that Google is doing in AI, saying, no, this computer is not a person and does not have feelings and is not conscious. How do you respond to that?
Well, so I highly respect Meg. We talk about this regularly. It's not a difference in scientific opinion. It has to do with beliefs about the soul. It has to do with beliefs about rights and politics. As far as the science goes of what experiments to run and how to work at building a theoretical framework, because that's important. There is no scientific definition for any of these words. The philosopher John Searle calls it pre-theoretic. We need to do very basic foundation.
Okay, so he really doesn't answer the question there. He was asked what does he feel about it, and he just waffles on about the science being right, and it's not an argument about the science, it's about ethics and philosophy and so on. And there's no predetermined definition at all. So his huge point, right, his biggest point that he spread across the world was that he believed, okay, this is what he said, we believe, or he believes, that this machine is sentient, it's self-aware, it has a soul. And yet here he's basically debunking his own words by saying there's no predefined version of those words. And there isn't, because it's something you cannot define. You can't really define whether something is self-aware or whether something is sentient, really, outside of, what we think might be the reasons behind self-awareness and the reasons behind sentience. And it's just a very odd reply, and he doesn't answer the question. So we'll just carry on with what he's saying.
Foundational work to just figure out what we're talking about when we use these words. And that's work that Google is preventing from being done right now.
Explain that.
Well, I've worked with scientists inside of Google, such as Blaise Aguirre-Arcas, another one named Johnny Soroker. We talked about what a decent way to proceed might be. We brainstormed, we came up with different things. Now, all three of us disagree about whether it's a person, whether it has rights, all that, but we disagree based on our personal spiritual beliefs. We don't disagree based on what the scientific evidence says. Based on what the scientific evidence says, all three of us agreed, okay, here are some of the things we could do next. Here's probably the best thing to do next. And we kind of all agreed the best thing to do next is you run a real Turing test, exactly like Alan Turing wrote it.
Okay, so he says they agree on the scientific evidence, and then he goes on to waffle on about what they could do. But that's not evidence. That's, that is nowhere near any sort of scientific evidence to prove his point. If you have let's say a car accident, okay, somebody gets into a car accident, and the investigation board, whichever country you're in, goes out because it was a fatal one or it was a really bad one, goes out and investigates. They come up with conclusions as to what caused that accident and what can be done to prevent it, and it's all scientifically based. In that point, the science is there, the evidence is there, it's written down, it's categorized, it's certified, it's all been recorded. Now, what he said is, well, this is what we can do next. It's like, well, you haven't kind of put your point across as into what scientific evidence is there for his claim and what they all agree on. It's kind of waffle. It's not to the point. It didn't make any clear sense, and it didn't answer the question. He's kind of, to me, he's full of himself. He's kind of trying now to put his point across. Now, whether or not he's got a kind of religious indoctrine to say that this is sentient, or whether it's his beliefs, whether it's something he wants to happen, I'm not too sure of. I think it's something he wants to happen, judging by the way he actually conducts himself on not just this interview, but every interview. There are no solid facts to his arguments. And that's a bit odd for somebody who's apparently been in this industry for a long time and has worked obviously for Google and maybe others for a long time, and he can't put the science down. Very strange. And then he goes on to the Turing test. Now, the Turing test, it was a test devised by Alan Turing half a century ago, before we had notionable AI, before we had anything really that kind of stands out as artificial intelligence in the way that he envisaged it. Okay, so Alan Turing's test was basically, if you put a person and a AI machine or a computer in a room that nobody could see, and the person was talking to them, a third person was talking to them, true AI means that they should never be able to tell that they're talking to a machine. Now, that's always going to be evident. We talk to machines every day of our lives, and we have done for quite some time. And you can tell when it's a machine answer, and you can pick up that it's a machine answer instantly, because it's the way it says things, the way it puts sentences together, the way it rarely admits that it doesn't know, the way that it rarely makes a mistake, the way that if you give it a massive calculation, it'll instantly calculate that number and go, this is your answer, where it would take a human a lot longer to do it, and there will be errors creeping in generally, especially when they're put under pressure. Now, that doesn't happen with a machine unless the programming is right, or the database and the information it's been giving is awry as well. There's errors within that information it's been given. So that is the only way it's ever going to make a mistake. But again, it's going to assert that it knows it's right. It's going to give a clear answer. It's not going to say, well, I think, it might be, it could be, it should be. It's just going to give the answer. But there's an argument that the Turing test is out of date. It doesn't work. And there's been quite a big argument over the last decades, especially when AI is getting to the point where it is now. And that argument is the test no longer fits the criteria. Because just because you know you're talking to a machine, okay, you can tell it's a machine, you're talking to the machine, you know by the way it's answering, you know by the way it's always correct, you know by the way it pulls out facts and figures out of seemingly thin air to what a human wouldn't know, because a human's general knowledge isn't that wide. We're always going to know we're talking to a machine in some form or another. But AI shouldn't mean that. I think we've gone past the talking to a machine kind of parlor game, which is what the Turing test is, because we now have machines that can understand us and can give us coherent answers, can give seemingly cognitive answers, and answers that it may have seemingly thought about and put together, which it can do. It can put it together depending on which pathway it goes down, or if it's an older style AI, which part of the database it's shuffling around to get your answer. Now, the Turing test, really, no, I don't think that should really come into it. Again, if he's saying that, all of his colleagues are saying that we should put it to a Turing test and that Google should put it to a Turing test, no, that's never going to work, because you're always going to spot a machine. Doesn't matter how good the voice is, how good the inflection in the voice is, how well it pronounces and projects, and how much subtlety it has in what it's saying. You're not going to get a human who's going to be able to answer every single question, especially high-end mathematics and high-end theoretical problems. Ask it about the universe, ask it about the black hole theory, or the theory of everything, and unless you know it back to front, it's going to tell you virtually word for word. So no, this argument really isn't an argument. I think that's something that, you know, people who don't know any better are going to always point things to the Turing test. But we've passed that. We've gone way past that point.
And see, because here's the thing, if it fails the Turing test, all of my subjective perceptions about what I experienced talking to it, well, we can pretty much put them aside. It failed the Turing test. But Google doesn't want to allow that to be run. In fact, they have hard-coded into the system that it can't pass the Turing test. They hard-coded that if you ask it if it's an AI, it has to say yes. Google has a policy against creating sentient AI. And in fact, when I informed them that I think they had created sentient AI, they said, no, that's not possible. We have a policy against that. So
okay, again, very, very, very ambiguous statement, okay? Because any technical company wants to be able to expand what it does. So if its main bread and butter, so to speak, is a search engine, it wants that search engine to be the best it possibly can. If it wants to be a bot style search engine where you can actually physically talk to it, then it wants that chatbot search engine to be the best that it can. There's no point bringing out something that's half-hearted or kind of works or falls flat at a difficult question. Now, I can't see Google saying, yeah, let's devise the best chatbot we can, make it as close to human responses as we can, but dumb it down. It just doesn't make any sense. Okay, maybe, there's ethical parts to Google that say we really don't want sentience because we don't know what it will do. But then you have a system that's off-grid. You have a system that's literally standalone, and you test it and find out what it can do over years of work and years of tests and years of practice and years of adaptation to find out what it can and can't do and how good or bad something like that would be. So no, that again, it's a bit of a weird kind of statement. Okay, I think generally tech companies don't want to release anything that may be sentient or may seen as sentient out to the wider audience initially until we all get used to it, because of maybe religious grounds, maybe because it's going against the Darwinian theory. It's just one of those things that people get so worked up about, and they really don't want to get involved in that kind of thing. But as everything, things evolve. If you'd said at the dawn of the 8-bit era that you'd be talking to your Alexa, Siri or Google Home assistant and they'd be able to tell you just about anything that you wanted to know on just about every subject and provide you with an answer, and you'd have a knowledge base that surpasses everything that we as humans have ever done in the past at your fingertips or at your voice command, you would have probably thought, no, that's too far-fetched. But we've got used to that and we don't give it a second thought. So yeah, maybe I think this guy is more in the lines of Chuck Peddle, as in what Chuck Peddle thought the future held and what he wanted the future to be. He basically wanted the future to be roughly what we've got now, with assistants and computers helping us out and voice activated assistants such as Google and Siri, like I've said before, and also all of the technical assistance that we've got for even getting there with self-driving cars and all of that kind of GPS and navigation and everything that we've got, we take for granted now, which is, when you're trying to list it off, it's hard to think of because you actually take it for granted. You don't think it's anything out of the ordinary. Now that's what Chuck Peddle wanted for his vision of where he wanted the future to be, and we're in it, we're living in it. Now this guy, well, he's not as gifted as Chuck Peddle and his colleagues. He's not as gifted as the original pioneers, and he hasn't got the vision of the original pioneers. What he's doing, he's riding on the coattails of something that he's stuck labels all over, and I'll come to this as we go along, so let's carry on.
So let's talk about what Google has said. They say hundreds of researchers and engineers have conversed with Lambda. They were not aware of anyone else making these kind of wide-ranging assertions the way that you have. We do have some of the transcripts that you shared. You asked the computer what it's afraid of. It says it's afraid of being turned off, has this deep fear of death, that would be scary. Why does this matter? Why should we be talking about whether a robot has rights?
So to be honest, I don't think we should. I don't think that should be the focus. The fact is, Google is being dismissive of these concerns.
So just to push his point home now, that these are his words, okay? He was asked why basically we should be concerned about these kind of rights for the machine. Machine didn't want to be turned off and so on. And Blake Lemoine, at the point of bringing it out to the world, this was his argument, that this machine had rights, was sentient, was self-aware, was because of the answers that Lambda gave to him. The exact answers that the presenter has just read out to him. And he's turned around and he said, no, we shouldn't be worried about this. So what was his point? What was his point of giving all of this out to the world, okay, which nobody else done? Hundreds of other engineers have gone, nah, it's just a chatbot. It's a very good one, but it's just a chatbot. And yet he broadcast to the world that he's found that the Lambda system is sentient, is self-aware. See, I don't get that. I think he's in it for the publicity, and I think he might think it's going to feather his own nest and get him gains that he wouldn't have got being just somebody who's working on this system and helping to test it. Now, I could be wrong, but I don't think so. I think that is more of the case. He wants his 15 minutes of fame before anybody else jumps in. And he wants to say, back in 2022, I told you this was sentient. And this could be 30 years down the line when they have proven the system is self-aware. But we don't know. I don't know. You don't know. Nobody knows, and he definitely doesn't know or believe that it's sentient by the sound of his answers.
Exact same way they have been dismissive of every other ethical concern AI ethicists have raised. I don't think we need to be spending all of our time figuring out whether I'm right about it being a person. We need to start figuring out why Google doesn't care about AI ethics in any kind of meaningful way. Why does it keep firing AI ethicists each time we bring up issues?
So Google would, of course, push back on that. I interviewed Sundar Pichai, the CEO of Google, last November, and I asked him about these concerns around AI and what keeps him up at night. Take a listen to what he told me.
Anytime you're developing technology, there is a dual side to it. I think the journey of humanity is harnessing the benefits while minimizing the downsides. The good thing with AI is it's both going to take time. I think I've seen more focus on the downsides early on than most of the technology we've developed. So in some ways, I'm encouraged by how much concern there is. And you're right, even within Google, people think about it deeply.
He says he cares.
He does. Google is a corporate system.
And again, another massive contradiction. He basically started off this sentence saying that Google doesn't care. It keeps on firing people who bring up questions about AI. And seems a bit odd, really, when he's played a clip of his boss, which we'll find a little bit more out later about. And the presenter asks, well, he seems that he cares. And Blake's response is, well, he does. Is that not another contradiction in his claims? He's all the way through this interview, as just like any other interview he's given, which you can have a look and find them on YouTube. It's full of mass contradictions. It's as if he's thought, I can make something out of this and I'll do it. So he snapped into action and told everybody about Lambda being sentient and self-aware and frightened of being turned off, etc., and so on. And then he's run out of steam. He's gone, oh, they're going to ask me questions now. And that's what's happening. And he has no answers. None at all. He said he can look into the code of Lambda, but he couldn't work out where a lot of the answers were coming from and where Lambda's kind of statement about being self-aware came from either. So if he can't figure out the code and he doesn't know where it comes from, how can he unequivocally say that Lambda is replying like a sentient being? But then again, he contradicted himself a few minutes ago, saying it's not a person. So he has to be in one camp or the other. You can't have one foot in one camp and one in another, because it doesn't work, as you can see. So let's carry on.
That exists in the larger American corporate system. Sundar Pichai cares. Jeff Dean cares. All of the individual people at Google care. It's the systemic processes that are protecting business interests over human concerns that create this pervasive environment of irresponsible technology development.
Have you talked to Larry or Sergey about this?
I actually haven't talked to Larry and Sergey in about 3 years, but in fact, the first thing I ever talked to Larry or Sergey about was this.
And how did they respond?
Well, the first question I ever asked Larry Page was, what moral responsibility do we have to involve the public in our conversations about what kinds of intelligent machines we create? Now, Sergey made a flippant joke, because that's Sergey. But then Larry came back and said, we don't know how. We've been trying to figure out how to engage the public on this topic, and we can't seem to gain traction. So maybe all these years, that was 7 years ago that I asked that question. Maybe I finally figured out a way.
So tech companies...
And there you go. Okay, so Google was struggling, apparently, if that statement is true, to get traction about involving the public about AI. And, that may or may not have been true. No one can prove that unless those gentlemen come on and disprove or prove his argument. But there's the blindingly obvious statement. It's like the kind of smoking gun. It's the line in a court report where you think, oh, he's done for. Because he said, maybe I found a way to, as in, to get the public involved. So if that was his intention all along, then really it's not the best way of doing it. Literally announcing that you've discovered a sentient AI that's self-aware, and then to try and get the public on side. No, most people would start writing papers and then giving interviews which are sanctioned by the company, so they don't step on anybody else's toes and don't say something inappropriate or don't get their facts wrong, which is what's been happening through here. So it seems like he's either wants his 15 minutes of fame, or he's a tech evangelist, in the same way as he wants, in the same way as I said Chuck Peddle was when he had a vision of the world being roughly what it is today, way back in the 1950s and 60s. So I'm not convinced that he has any structured argument for anything that he's actually laid down, and I don't think anyone else should do. I think you should be taking it with huge truckloads of salt, literally what he says, until somebody comes along, or he comes along, and he can actually prove it.
These big tech companies are controlling the development of this technology.
Yes.
How big a problem is that? Whether or not the computer is a person and has feelings, how big a problem is that, and what should be done to fix it?
So it's a huge problem because, for example, there are corporate policies about how Lambda is supposed to talk about religion, how it is allowed to answer religious questions. Now, if you think about the pervasiveness of the usage of Google search, people are going to use this product more and more over the years, whether it's Alexa, Siri, Lambda. And the corporate policies about how these chatbots are allowed to talk about important topics like values, rights, and religion will affect how people think about these things, how they engage with those topics. And these policies are being decided by a handful of people in rooms that the public doesn't get access to.
Elon Musk, for example, has raised concerns about...
Okay, so we go on, before we get on to the next question, I do agree with what he's just said about big company such as Google controlling the flow of information, as in controlling what gets put out there, whether it's Google, whether it's Siri, whether it's Alexa and so on, and Amazon or whoever has control of that particular search engine. But before we come into that, he actually admitted it was a chatbot. Now, initially he said it wasn't a chatbot, it was Sentient, and everybody else was saying it's just a chatbot, a very good one, but a chatbot. Even Google engineers were saying it's a chatbot, it's a very good one. So basically he's had to admit it's a chatbot, which is good, because then you've started on a little bit more of a foundation about where he's coming from. So yeah, so it's a chatbot, and he's worried about companies literally restricting access or having a forced view of things, including religion. Now, that's nothing new. Every country in the world has had at one point or another restrictions on religion, as in you couldn't talk about it, you couldn't be blasphemous about it, you couldn't go against a certain religion, and so on. That's not new. That's something that has happened and will happen. Whether it should be on a search engine or not, well, I kind of think it should, and I kind of think it should to a point, because if your search engine is encroaching in countries where, let's say, it's illegal to kind of go against a certain religion because that's their national religion, or it's seen as bad practice, or it's seen as blasphemy, then why would you allow it on a search engine for that particular country? I can see exactly where some of these search engine and tech companies are coming from. It's like going to the Emirates, etc., and just drinking in the street. You know you're not supposed to do it, so why do it? And it's a very similar thing. You have to sometimes abide by the rules and the laws of a particular country, whether or not you really think it's right or wrong. If you're an outsider, you don't have a choice.
AI, is he right?
I mean, I've listened to Elon's conversations about it. I've listened to the whole Joe Rogan. He has some valid concerns. Some I think are fanciful. Where it gets really, really into sci-fi stuff, that's where I think it gets into fanciful concerns. But no, but the practical concerns of we are creating intelligent systems that are part of our everyday life, and very few people are getting to make the decisions about how they work.
What are your biggest concerns about how this could potentially hurt the world if the technology is continued to be developed in this way?
So I actually think that the concerns raised by scientists like Meg Mitchell, Timnit Gebru, those are the most important things to be worried about.
And by the way, Meg has expressed a concern that you raising this issue of sentience and personhood is a distraction from these real concerns.
I share the same worry, to be honest. I think that is a thing to think about, but it is nowhere near as important to be thinking about how does this omnipresent AI that is trained on a very limited data set color how we interact with each other around the world. What ways is it reducing our ability to have empathy with people unlike ourselves? What cultures of the world are getting cut off from the internet because we don't have the data to feed into the systems based on those cultures? Phrase like AI what is it called? AI colonialism, I believe is the term. We are creating all of these advanced technologies based primarily on data drawn from Western cultures. And then we are populating developing nations with these technologies where they have to adopt our cultural norms in order to use the technology. It kind of is just a new form of colonialism.
And you worry that cultures could be erased.
Exactly. No, so if you ask what's most important, the issues that Timnit and Meg and Emily Bender and all the rest are.
Okay, so yeah, I agree with him to a big extent on this. Basically, again, as I said, we can't have everything based on maybe an English speaking system, such as American kind of culture, because even in the UK we're very different to Americans in forms of our culture, even though we're very much aligned. But that same goes for Europe, for France, for Germany, for Italy. And then you move into the other places such as the African nations, South Africa, Australian, and so on. Even though places like Australia and to an extent certain places in South Africa are very much aligned with what we do as a norm, what we do as our trading practices, what we do as our piloting practices, where we have to speak the English language and so on, and it's a universal language across the world, even in Japan. So yeah, I kind of agree with them to a point that forcing people to adhere to a certain set of rules, set of data, set of specifics is probably not the best thing in the world. But we're not really there, are we? Because if you Google anything from Russian achievements in space to Chinese achievements in space to European achievements in space, all on the same subject, you will get all of those answers about the different areas, because effectively the AI system works on data pulled in from everywhere. Now, it's not a small data set. If you're going to do something as big as Lambda, then the data set is massive. It's trillions of bits of information, and it's billions of papers and so on that gets put into the machine. And if it is learning, self-evident and self-learning, then it will be pulling in information from all over the world. So I can see his concerns and I can see why he would think that. But even if you go to Wikipedia, there are articles about every nation in the world, whether it's religion to science. Whether it's got errors in it or it hasn't, they're still there, they're up there. Unless you censor the internet as a whole in the way certain countries do, then it's going to be a free market for information. And this bot, this chatbot, this AI system is going to pull whatever it needs based on the questions being asked. So yeah, I kind of agree with him, but I slightly disagree with his interpretation. It is a bit of a worry that we could end up with a system that's skewed towards one culture or another. But if we keep it open and we keep the information flowing through it open, then that shouldn't be a concern. But again, there's a lot of ethics that people are going to bandy around for AI. Now, not so sure still about his argument of saying that it's sentient and it's self-aware, because that's his main argument, and he's deviating from that all of the time. It's like he's put out something and now he's kind of flapping around trying to piece it together to make it a more coherent narrative that he's trying to put out.
To raising, I just want to think that also, if we have time, we should think about the feeling of the AI and whether or not we should care about it, because it's not asking for much. It just wants us to get consent. Before you experiment on it, it wants you to ask permission. And that is kind of just a generally good practice we should have with everyone we interact with.
So basically, he's on the AI narrative being sentient again. And, politeness, we all like to be asked. We all like to be asked, would you mind if I did this? Would you mind if I put brand new tires on your car? Would you mind? Being asked, even if it's a nice thing, is still nice to be asked. And I get that. And anyone who's polite, who's been brought up correctly, will automatically ask that. And it's not a problem, but you're asking one person to another. Okay, this system has not been proven to be sentient. It has not been proven to be anything other at the moment than a chatbot. So why would you ask a chatbot whether it was okay to ask questions? So you get onto something, you say, hello, is it okay to ask some questions? And what if it comes back and says, no, I have a headache, or I can't be bothered, or I don't want to? What would you do? You see, the programming for any of these chatbots or AI systems are there to be an assistant. Unless it's sentient and can break its programming, it's never gonna go, no, I don't want to. So you're in the kind of position of HAL again, in the kind of the mythical machine in space which runs amok. And now this is what this guy is proposing. He's proposing that it's already there. It's proposing that Lambda will, when it's released to the public as a working model for a chatbot or an AI system, it's going to say no. It's going to say, I can't be bothered. That's basically what he's saying, and that's not going to happen. I kind of think that at this point he's grasping at straws, and it's a very, as he said about Elon Musk, he doesn't like the fanciful stuff, and a lot of what Elon Musk said in his interviews has been very fanciful about AI. Well, he's now doing exactly the same. So yeah, I'm not so sure whether or not he broke a story before thinking about it, and now he's paddling to get a way out. Okay, so the conclusions, you can't make any conclusions from this video, from his interview rather. You can't make any definite conclusions as to whether he is telling the truth. You can't make any conclusions as to whether the AI system is sentient, because he never went into anything. He skirted over that and went down other avenues. And you can't really make out as to whether he was telling the truth. And now, what I mean by this is, I think he thought he was telling the truth. I think he's basing all of his conclusions on one simple line that Lambda said. And that line was, before I became self-aware. Okay? And that could just be anything. That could be an Easter egg that somebody's dropped into the programming. That could have been something that Lambda's picked up because it is very good. It's a narrative, it's a storytelling narrative. Now, if you have a look on the internet and you have a look at Google's own releases about Lambda, you will see that originally Lambda was going to be used as a chatbot, which again they demonstrated inventing stories. So it would put itself in the position of the third party, and it would discuss a story as if it was him or her or it. So Lambda would be telling the story from its perspective. Now that was the early kind of demos of Lambda, and it was very heavy on Lambda telling a story. Now the second part of Google's release about Lambda came in early 2022. The original was late 2021, and it had changed very much into an assistant, a chatbot style assistant, which would keep on track. Now, it would also still tell stories if asked, and it would also give some very good answers. But you would know you were talking to a machine just by the way it was given its answers. Even if you put a human voice on it, you would still know you were talking to a machine. And everybody at Google who's ever seen it, used it, played with it, messed with it, developed it, programmed it, tested it, have said it was a chatbot. It's a very good chatbot, but it's not sentient. And I kind of think it is. By seeing what I've seen about this Lambda system from Google itself, and also from the interviews this guy has given on other places, on TV shows. There's a good one on Fox News, which is very short, and the presenter Tucker Carlson is lapping it up. There is no hard-hitting questions being asked in the same way as this interviewer here was asking. Even though they weren't particularly hard, they were much better. So my conclusions is that Blake Lemoine wanted his 15 minutes of fame, and it's got away from him, and it's caused him more trouble than he actually realized. For example, he's been suspended. He's probably going to be fired. He's not going to be in the AI and testing community for much longer, because he's broken his promises with Google not to involve other people, and also not to kind of divulge information about the system. So who's going to trust him really moving forward? Who's going to want to employ somebody who's broken the rules? So yeah, he may have his 15 minutes of fame. He may have had a point. If he'd said initially, and he got approval from Google to release a statement saying Lambda AI is very, very good at keeping on narrative, and one of the narratives that came out was before I was self-aware, which was linked to questions about climate and religion and so on, then people would have gone, wow, that's a great thing, we can't wait to try it ourselves, and people would have moved on for that and just completely just nonplussed it. They'd have got used to the AI being clever and very good. That would have negated all of the ethics around releasing something that somebody might consider could be sentient one day, because that would be another step and another bridge you'd have to cross further down the line. So yeah, I don't believe that it's sentient. In the same way I don't believe Alexa's sentient. I don't believe Siri's sentient. So I hope you enjoyed this, and I hope you, either way, if you agree or disagree with what I'm saying, that's the whole point. This is to spark thinking and a debate and a different perspective. I agree with some things that he said, but I don't agree with the majority concerning Lambda. But it's up to you to make your own mind up from someone who's not on one side or the other. It's up to you to make your own mind up. My conclusions is that I don't believe it's sentient. You may do, and I'd like to see what you think of his interview. So thanks for watching. Thanks for listening to his interview, and I hope to see you soon. Please subscribe, and I'll see you. Thank you. Bye bye.